Margarita has just given birth to 2 beautiful girls, and everything went very well. Timothy, the father, was glad that they had healthy girls together. The doctor asked them to take their daughters for a quick exam, and they both agreed. When the doctor entered the room, he heard something that made him turn pale. The babies were mumbling something to each other. The doctor ran to Margarita again. He told Timothy and Margaret that they had no time to lose. They had to seek help immediately. What he heard could be dangerous. The doctor sensed what was going on, but he had to confirm his suspicions. But then Timoteo had a big attack. The doctor told Timothy to calm down, but Timothy did not. When other doctors heard what was going on, they immediately rushed to the twins. The doctor had heard something that could be dangerous for the twins. The doctor did not want to tell what he had heard. The doctor called Margarita and Timoteo to his office. He asked some basic questions about their lives. I needed to know what was going on. Then Margarita told him about her life and her lifestyle, and the doctor's attitude changed completely. What did I do? He had realized something. As he took the weeping newborn twins to the analysis department, the doctor couldn't help but think, how did we get to this situation? For a brief moment, he paused when he heard them murmuring to each other again. The doctor knew now that he had made a big mistake. I'm sorry. His whole face has turned red, and he can barely look into the eyes of Margaret or her husband, Timothy. They had never seen him like this before. What's going on? When he finally starts talking, all he can do is stutter. I made a big mistake. Margarita's eyes widen and fill with tears when the doctor says those terrible words. But what mistake did the doctor make? And what did the twins murmur? After 3 years of trying to conceive, Margaret and her husband, Timothy, were prepared to hear the doctor say, I'm sorry, once again. They had already started to think that they were not going to have children, so when they found out she was pregnant, it was like a dream come true for both of them. Both Timothy and Daisy had been put through all kinds of tests to see if science could tell them what was going on. After so many attempts, the only plausible explanation suggested that there was something wrong with them. Fortunately, this was not the case. The doctor was waiting for them to give them good news at the next checkup. The doctor greeted the couple and said, Margarita, you are not going to have a child. You are going to have twins. She and Timothy couldn't believe it. Of course, they had never given up hope, but they were prepared to receive the same bad news as always. Tim, tell me this is not a dream, said Margarita, shaking her husband's hand. It sounded too good to be true. And it probably was. Pregnancy was not the only difficulty the couple had to face. A month before giving birth to her twins, Margarita was watching television when she suddenly began to feel painful stomach cramps. At least, that's how she could best describe the situation, since she had no idea what was going on with her. Nervous that something was wrong with her babies, she called Timothy and told him that she was experiencing the worst abdominal pain she had ever had. He ran home to pick her up. They had decided to make an extra visit to the doctor so that Margarita could describe the symptoms, in the hope that he would know what was going on. They just prayed that it was nothing serious. As they approached the hospital, they noticed the long queue to enter the parking lot. Timothy decided to leave Margarita at the entrance while he found a place. He arrived just in time to pick up his wife on her way to the doctor. It was a bad time. The small hospital was overflowing, and the doctor had to see Margarita at lunchtime due to her busy schedule. The doctor was a little agitated and in a hurry. Margarita described all her symptoms and concerns as he auscultated her abdomen with a stethoscope. After pressing on some parts of the abdomen with his fingers, the doctor concluded that there was no cause for concern. I was sure that the stomach cramps could have been caused by food poisoning or stress. The doctor apologized and left in a hurry. I was determined to eat something in the last 10 minutes I had left for lunch. Margarita and Timoteo were worried. The doctor's haste made them uneasy, as they thought he wasn't even paying attention to Margaret when she described her symptoms. Of course, he was her doctor and she wanted to trust him, but it seemed that he was more concerned about her lunch than her almost unbearable abdominal cramps. How could he have made a good assessment of her situation in just a few minutes? Could he know if there was something wrong with the babies just by pressing on the abdomen and hearing through the stethoscope? Time to think. Knowing there wasn't much they could do, they decided to go home and trust the doctor. Timothy went to get the car while Margaret waited for him a few steps from the door through which he had entered earlier. He had parked the car on a nearby street, so he would be back soon. During all this time, Timothy began to feel better with the doctor's diagnosis. There was no reason to doubt the doctor's words. He knew that the doctor was an eminence as an obstetrician. He was particularly busy that day because the women from the neighboring towns always came to consult him. In addition, Timothy knew that his doctor would never risk making a wrong diagnosis just because he was too busy or in a hurry to eat lunch. Timothy stopped the car and Margarita got in. On the way home, he tried to calm her down using all the arguments he had just thought of as he got in the car. However, his words turned out to be empty. Over the next few weeks, the pain continued to creep up her stomach. As the days went by, the frequency and intensity increased. At this point, both Margarita and Timoteo were very worried. Margarita decided that this time she would not go to the hospital. You would try to contact your doctor by phone. He didn't have to wait long. When the doctor attends and hears the symptoms of the same woman, he tries to calm her down. He insisted that stress was the cause of all his pain. But on the day Margaret was about to give birth, the pains stopped suddenly. Back home, the couple did what any other couple would do. They searched for information. They found many sites on the internet. They felt reassured when they read that it was normal for the actual date of birth to be different from the expected date. However, their concerns began to increase when they learned that it was definitely unusual to overstay their due date for several weeks with no signs of going into labor. At this time, Margarita and Timoteo spoke daily on the phone with the doctor and, although he had tried to comfort them during the first 2 weeks, he himself was starting to get a little worried. Of course, he knew that the pregnancy could extend a few days beyond the expected date of delivery, but Margarita had already exceeded the expected date for more than 3 weeks. Did you miss anything when Margarita reported those stomach pains? He had followed the usual procedures, auscultation and palpation, and had found nothing strange. But the woman's prolonged pregnancy was raising serious doubts about her diagnosis. If he had missed something, what would be the consequences of his possible mistake? However, there was something he could do. The doctor then became a little more worried. Without hesitation, he contacted Margarita to see how she was. The pain had not returned, which was a good sign. What wasn't a good sign was the fact that she didn't go into labor, so the doctor gave her some tips on how to induce labor naturally. But when nothing worked, she remembered that there was something she hadn't tried yet. One of the natural ways to induce labor that the doctor mentioned was to make love. But with all the worries Margaret was having, making love was the last thing she wanted to do. Timothy was very supportive of her and wanted the best for his wife and twins. They had tried everything but sex. But when Timothy finally convinced her, it ended up making all the difference. Soon after the moment, Margaret felt that all her worries had been allayed. However, the tranquility did not last long, as he began to feel a sharp pain in his stomach. Apparently, it had worked. She was going into labor. When Timothy realized what was going on, he immediately put on some clothes and helped Margarita into the car. Once in the car, they kissed and left for the hospital. On the way to the hospital, Timothy called the doctor and told him that Margarita had gone into labor a few minutes earlier. When they arrived, the delivery and birth rooms were waiting for her. Luckily, he had called ahead of time, as they would end up having only a second to spare. From then on, things seemed to happen very quickly. After being in the room for less than 10 minutes, one of the babies started to crow like a rooster. They had to do it now and called a doctor to come and help. Timothy and Daisy had not been in the hospital room for more than 10 minutes when it happened. It was a kind of scream that filled the room, coming from one of the babies. The couple looked each other in the eye. They both knew that this had to happen now. Fortunately, one of the nurses seemed determined, and a doctor was called to come help. The doctor appeared with a quick step around the corner, surprising Timothy at first sight. The two realized at that moment that they had been in contact before, at the moment when this doctor had so rudely put aside Margarita's concerns a few months ago. Was it a coincidence? How could this doctor still help them in this critical phase? Although Timothy realized this in an instant, Margaret was in too much pain to even look up to greet the doctor, let alone recognize the man. Timothy realized this. On the one hand, I wanted to try to refuse the doctor's help. However, he knew that there was little time left, and that it was necessary to act quickly. There was probably no one else able to help in time. Timothy naturally kept an eye on the doctor in the steps that followed. When everything was prepared quickly and professionally, the doctor seemed to be fully committed to the process. This calmed Timothy significantly. He focused again on his wife, who was in labor. She now needed all the support she could get from him. From here, things became a little easier. Half an hour after the doctor arrived, the first baby had already been born. Timothy took the newborn in his arms. She could hardly believe she was looking at her own son. They quickly cut the umbilical cord, and then he handed the baby to a nurse who was next to him. However, the work here was not yet finished. Of course, there was the second one that was now coming into the world. As is often the case with twins, the second is the one that brings the most problems. At least for another 2 hours, Margarita had to push. Eventually, after that time, they began to make some progress. Margarita felt that she had given all the energy she had left in her body. At that time, Margaret was really exhausted, but she kept her energy with the thought that she didn't want to have a cesarean section. This kept her steady until the end, and finally, the second baby began to sing. She felt relieved. The fact that this child also came into the world with his head held high allowed him to relax a little in the hospital room. It was the second child that the couple had finally put on earth. They were born, and Margarita had fulfilled her mission. Now he could finally surrender to his exhaustion. They held the second baby for a brief moment, before he was quickly taken away by the nurse for some normal tests as well. Now, it was Timothy who had an additional request. The reason Timothy had another request was that they had experienced an abnormal amount of problems during their pregnancy. Timothy asked the nurses to accompany him during the tests to make sure everything was okay with the two babies. It was not a usual procedure, and one of the nurses explained that authorization from the medical director was required. This was a problem for Timothy. Timothy's problem with this is that he did not want the doctor to know about the special request, for he did not yet fully trust him. Her fear was that the doctor would not take her concerns as seriously as she did last time. The doctor could dismiss the additional examination as an unnecessary cost, or something like that. Timothy told this to the nurses, explaining the previous experience he had had with this doctor. Timothy's request put the nurses in a difficult position. What was more important, following the procedures or the health care itself? The nurses discussed the matter among themselves and eventually decided to do what Timothy had asked. Their concerns were, after all, understandable, although they could not imagine that the doctor would have the unprofessional reaction that Timothy had predicted. While the nurses continued to do their tests, Timothy quickly returned to his wife to comfort her. What a relief it must be for Daisy. She had been through so much in the last 9.5 months, and now the hardest part was finally over. Or so they thought for a moment. Margaret looked Timothy in the eye, exhausted as she was. She made it clear to her husband that all she wanted now was to have her precious babies in her arms. Timothy knew that this might take some time to happen. He explained to him that he had ordered additional tests to make sure that the 2 babies were in good health. Margarita was a little angry, but Margaret could not be completely at ease. She really understood why her husband demanded this, and rationally recognized that it was indeed a smart move. However, she also missed the newborn children she had carried for so many months. In addition, Margarita also realized that something could be wrong. Time passed slowly, minute by minute, until, after more than 2 hours, someone knocked on the door. The couple waited there, by the bed, so tense that none of them had moved during the waiting period, not even to go to the bathroom. Timothy confirmed that they were still there and that the nurse could come in. The husband and wife, restless, were certainly waiting for 2 nurses to enter, bringing the babies with them and delivering them. Instead, when the room opened up financially, that prediction turned out to be false. In fact, Timothy and Margaret were confronted with a vision they did not expect at all. In fact, it was not a nurse who entered, but a man in a doctor's uniform. The doctor who had appeared and who had helped Margaret in the birth, and also before, the doctor they knew very well, but also the doctor in whom they did not fully trust. He was here now with a restless expression. Timothy and Margaret immediately realized that something was wrong. He could barely look the couple in the eye. The doctor seemed stern and confident enough in the times they had interacted before, but now he was like someone else. He walked slowly, acted hesitantly, and kept his hands together in front of his chest, shoulders forward. The 2 of them in bed had never seen this behavior on his part, but before Timothy or Margaret could say anything or ask what was going on, the doctor began to stammer, saying, I'm sorry." It took no more than these words for the 2 husbands and wives to feel their world coming crashing down. The doctor paused for a long time before continuing. Timothy immediately felt that there was something very wrong with the babies. How could it be? The additional tests were requested just to be more certain. It turns out that Timothy was only partially right. The examination resulted in the conclusion that the twins had caught a bacterium during Margarita's pregnancy. The doctor announced this fact with a very serious tone. If Timothy didn't have this voice in his head telling him that a further examination was needed, they could have left this room by now. If they had let them go, the situation would have been very problematic. Fortunately, as the nurses had now discovered, the bacteria could be easily treated, and the babies were not expected to suffer harm for the rest of their lives. They came to the conclusion that, most likely, the bacteria had been caught because of Margarita's stomach pains. The doctor was very aware of the fact that he had largely ignored these complaints all these months. He felt really bad about it. Making such a mistake was unforgivable, he thought. The doctor's attitude from before came very close to causing disastrous consequences. Only because Timothy had a sense of distrust toward him was this avoided. The doctor was now there, embarrassed and with tears in his eyes, asking if the couple would ever be able to forgive him for his actions. One would expect Timothy and Margaret to have trouble forgiving the doctor. Instead, they were very happy that their twins were healthy and unharmed. As they had waited for so long in extreme tension, now, finally, the weight of the world has fallen from their shoulders. The weight also fell off the doctor's shoulders, and he promised himself that his attitude would change a lot from now on. The time finally came when Timothy and Margaret walked out the front door of the hospital the following week. They were tired, but above all, very happy. In the weeks that followed, it was found that the bacteria did not cause any further health problems. The family was looking forward to spending the rest of their lives together.